Vladimir Putin has been in power for a really long time. Over 2 decades, he has faced many challenges while building up power at home and growing his country's influence on the global stage. But coronavirus could be his biggest test yet.
Ситуация в целом находится под контролем.
Despite his reassurances that everything was fine, Russia has become a global coronavirus hotspot, and its infrastructure has come under strain. Russians worry the pandemic will worsen their economic problems. And now, as constitutional changes could potentially allow Putin to remain in office until 2036, the president has to deal with unexpectedly low approval ratings.
The figures are really quite bad for Putin. It's the lowest it's been in 20 years since he first came to power.
So, can the Russian president actually keep all the power he's accumulated? Vladimir Putin has served as either Prime Minister or President of Russia since 1999. The former intelligence officer has fought to change the image of a crumbling Russian state.
So the framework that Putin came on was very much to try to rise and rebuild Russia's position as a great power.
Early in his tenure, he faced a number of crises. A few weeks into his time as acting Prime Minister, a series of bombings in Moscow killed hundreds, triggering a second Chechen war, which this time Russia won. The military offensive boosted Putin's popularity and helped him secure the presidency in 2000. And over the years, Putin has nurtured this image of himself, a tough statesman who restored the country's national pride. Putin's boldness fostered nationalism and kept him popular in Russia, but strained his relationship with Western leaders. He poured resources into the military and made it a tool for his foreign policy, which caught international attention in the Russo-Georgian War in 2008.
2008 marked a change in the way that Russian great powerness were going to be implemented, and increasingly it is implemented using the military on the ground.
When Putin's opponents took to the streets after he was elected again in 2012, Russian officials accused the US of instigating the demonstrations.
Но когда деньги из-за границы вкладываются в политическую деятельность внутри страны, это должно нас заставить задуматься.
Of course, the US denied that. Putin, we couldn't believe that all those people out on the streets were there of their own volition. So it was much easier for him to blame the US, the West.
Hundreds were arrested and protests waned after the government imposed new rules on public demonstrations. The annexation of Crimea and Putin's support for the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria added to international tensions. Moscow has also been accused of meddling in the 2016 US election, among other allegations, including state-backed disinformation and hacking. Russia has repeatedly rejected these claims.
Listen to what I say. First of all, Russia, as a state, has never interfered with the internal affairs of the United States.
But the coronavirus pandemic has introduced a whole new challenge for the 67-year-old leader. When coronavirus infections began to ramp up in Russia, Putin closed its border with China and implemented restrictions on travel from Europe. But he was criticized for not imposing a strict nationwide lockdown.
Все уровни власти работают ритмично, организованно, ответственно.
While the president and state media insisted that everything was under control, some officials contradicted the government's narrative. In May, the health minister of Dagestan suggested in an interview that the real number of coronavirus cases in his province could have been more than 4 times higher than the official figures. Forcing Putin to acknowledge that the virus was an issue in some parts of the country.
А в Дагестане ситуация складывается сейчас непросто.
Medical personnel have taken to social media to criticize the government's handling of the pandemic and warned that the healthcare infrastructure was overwhelmed. But Putin and Russia's national media outlets have persisted in painting a more positive picture.
При определенных издержках, при проблемах, при потерях, но все-таки мы достаточно ритмично, так скажем, работаем и выходим из этой ситуации с коронавирусом уверенно, с минимальными потерями.
Even as the collapse in oil prices was hitting Russia's economy hard, Moscow trumpeted efforts to send medical aid to Italy and the US. And in late June, ahead of a referendum that may allow Putin to run for 2 more terms after his tenure ends in 2024, soldiers marched in a parade to celebrate the country's victory over Germany in World War II, despite concerns that the virus may spread.
That is one way he's dealing with trying to sort of boost the nationalist pride and saying we were solely responsible for this victory and this is what makes us a great power.
As part of the referendum, the Russian president has also offered a number of measures to support the economy. Still, his popularity has waned in recent months. In a recent poll, only 25% of Russians named Putin among the politicians they trust most, down from 59% in 2017. The economy has contracted, and the pandemic has grown to become an unexpected challenge for Russia's government. But analysts believe that Vladimir Putin is determined to hold on to power.
He's still solidly in power, but I think there are many more questions about what happens going forward and about, his willingness and ability to introduce economic reforms that would make people's lives better.